May 24, 1941. The North Atlantic. Admiral Gunther Lütjen stood on the bridge of the Bismarck, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the gray mist of the Denmark Strait met the icy black waters of the deep. For a man of his experience, the silence was more deafening than the roar of the engines. He knew that beneath the steel deck of the most powerful battleship ever built by Germany, over 2,000 young men were waiting, not for a lecture on naval doctrine, but for the first test of their lives. Lütjens felt the weight of an entire nation's pride. This wasn't just a ship. It was a floating fortress designed to break the back of the British Empire. As the first light of dawn broke, the silence was shattered by the scream of a lookout. Two silhouettes had emerged from the fog, the HMS Prince of Wales and the pride of the Royal Navy, the HMS Hood. The world was no longer just at war. It was witnessing the climax of an era. For centuries, the battleship had been the ultimate symbol of national sovereignty, a massive, armor-plated statement of intent. In 1941, the oceans were the world's most vital supply lines, and these steel behemoths were the apex predators tasked with either protecting or severing them. If the Bismarck could break out into the open Atlantic, the convoys feeding a besieged Britain would be slaughtered. The stakes were absolute. On the bridge of the Hood, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland knew the risks. His ship was fast and elegant, but her deck armor was a known Achilles heel. Yet, there was no room for hesitation. At 5:52, the order was given. The Hood's massive 15-inch guns rotated, let out a thunderous roar, and the battle that would define the naval history of the 20th century began. In those opening minutes, as shells the size of small cars tore through the sky, the true terrifying power of the battleship was laid bare. May 24, 1941, 6:01 a.m. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. A single 15-inch armor-piercing shell from the Bismarck, fired from over 9 miles away, traced a high, lethal arc through the morning sky. It found its mark with terrifying precision, plunging to the Hood's thin deck armor and detonating inside the aft magazines. A pillar of fire, hundreds of feet high, erupted from the center of the British battlecruiser. The ship, the mighty Hood, which had embodied British naval supremacy for 20 years, snapped in two. In less than 3 minutes, she vanished beneath the waves, taking 1,415 men with her. Only 3 survived. On the bridge of the Bismarck, there was no cheering, only a grim, stunned silence. The crew had just witnessed the instantaneous destruction of a legend, but Admiral Lütjens knew that while they had won the duel, they had ignited a hornet's nest. The sinking of the Hood was not just a military loss for Britain. It was a deep psychological wound. In London, Winston Churchill's reaction was immediate and uncompromising. He issued a 3-word command that would redirect the entire resources of the Royal Navy: sink the Bismarck. The hunt was no longer about tactical advantage. It was about vengeance and survival. Every available British vessel in the North Atlantic, battleships, cruisers, and the fledgling power of aircraft carriers, abandoned their convoys to turn their bows toward the Bismarck's last known position. Lütjens, realizing his ship had been damaged and was leaking oil, made a fateful decision to break for the coast of occupied France. He was running a gauntlet of steel across 1,000 miles of open ocean. The Bismarck was a wounded predator, and the Royal Navy was closing in, desperate to prove that the era of the battleship was not yet over, even as the shadows of a new kind of warfare began to lengthen over the sea. May 26, 1941, 9 p.m. The Atlantic was screaming. A force 9 gale whipped the waves into towering walls of salt and foam, tossing the heavy British destroyers like toys. Somewhere in this liquid chaos, the Bismarck was slipping away. If she could reach the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe in France, she would be untouchable. The British were running out of fuel and time. The greatest hunt in naval history was failing. Then, through the storm clouds, came an unlikely savior: the slow, fabric-covered ferry swordfish biplanes of the HMS Royal. To the German anti-aircraft gunners, these string bags looked like relics of a bygone era. But as the biplanes dived into a wall of fire, one torpedo found its mark. While the smoke was still rising from the ruins of Pearl Harbor, a secret that had been years in the making was finally unveiled. Under the strictest veil of censorship, the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned the Yamato. She was not merely a ship. She was a miracle of engineering and a symbol of national destiny. At 72,000 tons fully loaded, she was the largest battleship ever built, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest rifle barrels ever put to sea. A single salvo from these guns weighed as much as a fighter plane and could hurl shells 26 miles into the distance. Admiral Isoroku Yamato looked upon this behemoth with a mixture of pride and profound anxiety. He knew that the Yamato represented Japan's belief in Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. The Japanese High Command believed that a single, titanic clash between battleship lines would determine the fate of the Pacific. To them, the Yamato was the ultimate insurance policy, but the Pacific was a different theater than the Atlantic. It was a war of vast, empty distances where the horizon was the only landmark. As the Yamato and her sister ship, the Musashi, moved through the sparkling waters of the Truk Lagoon, they were essentially kings without a kingdom. The devastating irony of the Yamato was that the very air power Japan had used to cripple the American fleet at Pearl Harbor had rendered the super battleship obsolete before it even fired a shot in anger. The Americans, however, were not surrendering the surface of the sea. In the shipyards of Brooklyn and Philadelphia, the Iowa-class battleships were being born. These were the American response. Fast battleships designed to keep pace with carrier groups, bristling with anti-aircraft guns and governed by the latest radar technology. The stage was set for a confrontation between the old world's obsession with caliber and the new world's mastery of technology. The giants were heading toward collision, but the skies above them were starting to fill with wings. April 7th, 1945. The East China Sea. The Yamato was on a suicide mission. Operation Tengo was a desperate, final throw of the dice by an empire that had run out of options. With only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa, the world's greatest battleship was ordered to beach herself and fight as a shore battery until she was destroyed. There was no air cover. There was no hope of return. On the bridge, Admiral Seiichi Ito remained silent, a man who knew he was presiding over a funeral pyre of steel. The end did not come from the heavy guns of an American battleship. Instead, it came from the sky. Over 300 aircraft from Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Fast Carrier Task Force swarmed the Yamato like a cloud of hornets. For 2 hours, the giant endured a relentless hammering. Torpedoes tore into her port side, and armor-piercing bombs turned her decks into a chaotic slaughterhouse. As the Yamato began to list, the internal alarms were drowned out by the roar of fires reaching the magazines. At 2:23 p.m., a cataclysmic explosion, so massive the smoke plume was seen 120 miles away, ripped the ship apart. The era of the battleship didn't just end, it evaporated. Of her 3,332 crewmen, only 276 were pulled from the water. The war concluded with the American Iowa-class battleships, like the USS Missouri, serving as a stage for the final surrender. It was a fitting irony. The ships designed for the ultimate destruction became the platforms for the ultimate peace. Today, these steel titans rest in two places, as silent, rust-streaked shipwrecks at the bottom of the world's oceans, or as hollowed-out museums moored in quiet harbors. They remain monuments to a brief, thunderous window in human history, a time when the power of a nation was measured by the size of its guns and the courage of the men who stood upon their decks, staring into the smoke of the horizon. The reign of the battleships was over, but the legends of their fire and fury would echo through the deep forever.